Nobody ever tells you that the quietest funerals are the ones that hide the loudest truths. Margaret Collins stood just inside the small Ohio church where her husband, John Collins, was being honored, though it felt to her like something far less certain than honor. The air was too still, the smiles too carefully practiced, and every handshake she received felt like it lasted half a second too long before being withdrawn. People she had known for years suddenly looked like strangers who had rehearsed their sympathy in advance. John had been gone for only a short time, yet Margaret already felt as if the version of him everyone was praising belonged to a different life than the one she had lived beside him for decades. She adjusted her black coat sleeves, not because she was cold, but because she needed something to hold on to. The church bells outside had stopped ringing, but the silence they left behind seemed to echo louder than any sound. Somewhere behind her, she heard soft murmurs about arrangements, about memories, about how suddenly everything had happened, but no one ever finished their sentences when she turned to look. Even her own family circle felt shifted, as if positions had been rearranged without her approval. Her daughter-in-law, Sophie Collins, stood near the front pews speaking in low tones with relatives, her posture composed in a way that felt more like control than grief. Margaret noticed how often Sophie's eyes drifted away whenever they might have met hers. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it wasn't comfort either. It was distance, intentional and practiced. Margaret had expected sorrow, confusion, even shared disbelief. What she did not expect was coordination, as if everyone had agreed on a version of events she had not been invited to hear. When she looked at the framed photograph of John placed near the altar, she tried to match it to the man she had known over breakfast conversations, quiet drives, and years of ordinary evenings. The image felt correct but incomplete, like a page torn from a larger story. A sudden tightening in her chest made her realize she was waiting for something without knowing what it was. That was when she first noticed the absence of explanation rather than the presence of grief. No one had told her everything about the days leading up to John's passing, and no one seemed eager to start now. The pastor's voice rose gently, offering words about peace and remembrance, but they floated above her like they belonged to someone else's experience. Margaret nodded when others did, smiled when expected, and accepted condolences with hands that felt strangely disconnected from her own thoughts. And beneath all of it, beneath the polished stillness of the service, there was a growing certainty she could not yet name. Something about this day had been carefully arranged to look simple, when in fact it was anything but. Never before had Margaret Collins felt time move so strangely slowly, and yet so sharply at the same moment, as if every second inside the small Ohio church was stretching itself thin to make space for something unspoken. After the service had officially ended and people began shifting into quiet clusters of conversation, she remained near the side aisle, still trying to understand why nothing about this day felt complete. That was when she saw her again. The woman she had noticed earlier, the one who had stood apart from everyone else without belonging to any clear circle of family or friends, was now closer, positioned near one of the side exits as if waiting for the right moment that no one else was aware of. Margaret had not been introduced to her, and yet there was something unsettling about how familiar the woman seemed in her attention. The woman's eyes met hers briefly, not with sympathy, but with recognition, as though Margaret was the one person she had come here to see. Margaret hesitated before moving closer, excusing herself politely from a short exchange with a distant relative. The air between them felt heavier the closer she got, not from hostility, but from the weight of withheld information. The woman's appearance was simple, her dark coat plain, her hands steady, and her expression carefully controlled. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence felt deliberate rather than accidental. Then, without any greeting or explanation, the woman reached into her coat and placed a sealed envelope into Margaret's hands. The gesture was quiet, almost invisible to those nearby, yet it carried a force that made Margaret instinctively tighten her grip. Before Margaret could ask a single question, the woman leaned slightly closer and said in a low voice that barely rose above the surrounding noise that there were things she needed to know about John Collins that had never been part of the life she believed she had shared with him. The words did not come with emotion or drama, only certainty, which made them more unsettling than anything spoken during the entire service. Margaret tried to respond, but the woman had already stepped back, her gaze shifting away as if the moment had ended exactly when it was meant to. Within seconds, she turned and walked toward the side exit, blending into the movement of people leaving the building, until she was no longer distinguishable from anyone else. Margaret stood still, holding the envelope as if it had become heavier than paper should be. Around her, conversations resumed, chairs shifted, and footsteps echoed across the polished floor, but none of it seemed to reach her anymore. Sophie Collins appeared briefly at the edge of her vision, speaking to someone on a phone call with a calmness that felt rehearsed, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. Sophie looked away almost immediately, too quickly to be accidental, and that brief avoidance settled into Margaret's thoughts like an unanswered question. She finally opened the envelope with hands that refused to remain steady, expecting perhaps condolences or legal documents or something easily explained away by grief, but what she found instead was something that disrupted the entire foundation of what she thought she understood about the last years of her husband's life. And in that instant, standing alone among the fading noise of a funeral that was no longer just a farewell, Margaret realized that whatever truth had been placed into her hands was only the beginning of something far larger than sorrow. Never in her life had Margaret Collins expected that something as small as a single sealed envelope could feel heavier than every word spoken at her husband's funeral. Yet as she stood just outside the small Ohio church entrance, the paper in her hand seemed to carry a weight that pressed against her thoughts more than her palms. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she stared at it as people continued to move past her, offering soft condolences that now felt distant and almost disconnected from the reality she was beginning to sense. The name of her husband, John Collins, still echoed in her mind, but it no longer felt stable, as if the image she had carried for decades was quietly shifting beneath her understanding. Finally, with careful hesitation, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first lines were simple, almost clinical in tone, referencing financial accounts she had never heard of and instructions tied to assets she did not recognize. Margaret blinked slowly, reading the same sentence twice, then a third time trying to make it match anything she knew about the life she and John had shared. Nothing aligned. There were mentions of a private account in a bank she had never visited, along with references to safety deposit arrangements that had never been discussed in their home in Ohio. Her breathing slowed, not from calm, but from disbelief building in steady layers. As she continued reading, the language shifted from financial details to something more personal, suggesting that certain arrangements had been made in secrecy for years, long before John's passing. Margaret lowered the letter slightly and looked around, suddenly aware of how ordinary everything still appeared outside the church, as if the world had no idea that something beneath the surface had just fractured. Inside the letter, there was also a short line that referenced another individual, someone identified only indirectly, connected to meetings and exchanges that had taken place without her knowledge. That was the moment the air around her seemed to change. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the paper, trying to steady herself, but the questions were already forming faster than she could control them. Why would John keep something like this hidden? Why would anyone involved feel the need to leave instructions delivered in secrecy rather than trust? And most importantly, who had just placed this envelope into her hands at a funeral where every face she had seen was supposed to represent a shared history of trust and familiarity? Margaret folded the letter carefully, as if precision could somehow restore order, and slipped it back into the envelope. Around her, the sound of footsteps and distant conversations continued, but she felt increasingly separated from them, as though she were standing slightly outside of the timeline everyone else still occupied. Her thoughts returned to the woman who had handed her the envelope, the stranger with calm eyes and no introduction, and she realized with growing unease that the encounter had not felt accidental in any way. Meanwhile, inside the church, she caught a glimpse of Sophie Collins speaking with quiet urgency to another family member, her expression controlled yet sharp in a way that now felt different from before. Sophie's gaze briefly moved toward Margaret again, but this time it lingered for a fraction longer, as if she already knew that something had changed. Margaret turned away slowly, holding the envelope closer to her side, understanding that whatever truth had just entered her hands was not an ending but the first step into something that had been carefully hidden long before this day ever began. Night had not yet fully settled over the small Ohio town, but Margaret Collins already felt as if the day had lasted far beyond its natural limit, stretching from the quiet heaviness of the funeral into something far more uncertain as she sat alone in her car parked a few blocks from the church, the envelope resting on the passenger seat like an object that refused to be ignored. She had not driven home immediately because the thought of returning to her empty house, the house she had once shared with John Collins, felt unbearable in a way she could not yet explain. Instead, she remained still, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed forward, replaying every word she had just read inside that letter. Financial accounts she had never known about, instructions, written with a precision that suggested long preparation, and references to meetings that had taken place outside of her awareness all circled in her mind without settling into a clear conclusion. The most unsettling part was not the complexity of the information but the simplicity of its implication, that an entire layer of her husband's life had existed parallel to hers without ever intersecting in a way she could see. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, then turned her head slightly toward the envelope again. For a moment she considered leaving it closed, placing it in her glove compartment, and attempting to return to normalcy, but she understood even without fully admitting it that normalcy was no longer available to her in the same form. Her phone vibrated softly in her purse, breaking the silence, and when she checked it, she saw a message from Sophie Collins asking if she was all right and whether she would be coming home directly. The message was polite, carefully worded, and yet it carried a tone that felt more like checking a boundary than expressing concern. Margaret did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied the words, noticing how quickly Sophie had reached out after the funeral, as if timing itself mattered. That thought led her back to the woman who had handed her the envelope, the stranger whose presence now felt less like coincidence and more like intention. Margaret finally started the car and drove slowly through the familiar streets of the town, passing houses she had known for years, yet feeling as though she no longer belonged to the same version of them. When she arrived home, the house was dark except for a small porch light left on by habit. She stepped inside and was immediately struck by how unchanged everything appeared, as if nothing significant had happened at all. The silence inside was heavier than the silence at the church, because here there were no distractions, no polite conversations, only the echo of absence. She placed her coat on a chair and walked into the kitchen, setting the envelope on the table but not opening it again. Instead, she looked around the room where she and John had spent so many ordinary evenings, meals, and conversations that now felt strangely distant, as if they had belonged to a version of life that was no longer accessible. Her eyes lingered on a photograph near the refrigerator, one taken during a summer trip years ago, and for the first time she wondered how many other moments like that might now carry meanings she had never understood. The thought was interrupted by another vibration from her phone, this time a call from Daniel Brooks, the family lawyer. She stared at the screen for several seconds before answering, her voice steady but cautious as she greeted him. On the other end, Daniel's tone was careful, almost restrained, as he asked whether she had received anything unusual during the day. That question alone confirmed what she had begun to suspect, that the envelope was not an isolated gesture but part of something already in motion. Margaret glanced back at the envelope on the table, her reflection faintly visible on its sealed surface, and realized that whatever truth had begun to surface at the funeral was now quietly moving into her home, into her life, and into every assumption she had once considered unshakable. The house felt quieter than it had any right to be, as if even the walls of Margaret Collins's home in Ohio were listening to the questions she no longer knew how to silence. She stood in the kitchen long after the call with Daniel Brooks had ended, her phone resting face down on the counter as though it had become too heavy to hold. The envelope still sat exactly where she had placed it earlier, untouched, yet its presence now felt impossible to ignore. Every few seconds her eyes returned to it, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a growing awareness that whatever was inside had already begun to reshape her understanding of everything she thought she knew about John Collins. She finally pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, her movements careful, as if sudden motion might disturb something fragile in the air. For several minutes she did nothing, simply looking at the sealed edges of the paper, remembering the tone of Daniel Brooks's voice when he asked whether she had received anything unusual. The phrasing had not sounded like surprise. It had sounded like confirmation. That detail stayed with her more than she wanted it to. Outside, a faint wind moved through the trees lining her street, carrying the ordinary sounds of a quiet neighborhood evening, yet inside the house everything felt detached from ordinary time. Margaret reached for the envelope again, turning it over in her hands, noticing for the first time a faint marking on the back, something that looked less like a personal note and more like a reference or code. It was not clear enough to understand immediately, but it was precise enough to suggest intention. She pressed her thumb lightly against it, then set it down again, her thoughts now shifting toward Sophie Collins. Since returning from the funeral, Sophie's messages had continued in short, controlled intervals, each one polite, each one carefully neutral, and yet none of them explained why Daniel Brooks had also called with such specific timing. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall, each one representing a moment she now questioned in a way she had never done before. Years of memories, vacations, birthdays, ordinary evenings, all suddenly felt like they might contain gaps she had never noticed because she had never been asked to look closely. When her phone vibrated again, she did not immediately reach for it. Instead, she waited, letting the sound repeat itself until it stopped. Only then did she pick it up and see another message from Daniel Brooks requesting that she come to his office the following morning at 10 o'clock. No explanation followed, only the time and address of his office in downtown Columbus. That absence of detail felt more significant than any explanation could have been. Margaret set the phone down again and looked at the envelope with a different kind of attention, one that no longer belonged to uncertainty, but to recognition that something structured was unfolding around her. She thought again about the woman who had handed it to her, the calmness in her expression, the way she had spoken as if she were delivering not information but timing. And then, almost without realizing it, Margaret stood up and walked toward the window overlooking her quiet street. Everything outside remained unchanged, neighbors' lights glowing softly, cars parked neatly, the familiar stillness of a place that believed itself stable. Yet inside her home, that stability no longer felt guaranteed. She returned to the table, finally opening the envelope once more, this time reading not only for information but for pattern, for anything that could explain why John Collins's life had begun to appear divided into layers she had never been allowed to see. And as she reached the end of what she had already read, she understood with growing clarity that this was no accidental discovery, no simple mistake revealed after death, but the beginning of something carefully arranged long before she had ever been asked to notice it. The morning light over Margaret Collins's quiet Ohio neighborhood felt unchanged, yet everything within her had already shifted into a different rhythm that no longer matched the calm outside her window. She had barely slept. The envelope had stayed on the kitchen table all night, untouched but never forgotten, as if its presence alone had been enough to keep her mind from settling. When she finally sat down again that morning, the first thing she noticed was how ordinary the house still looked. The same chairs, the same framed photographs, the same familiar silence that once meant safety now felt like distance. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, she left her home and drove toward downtown Columbus, following Daniel Brooks's instructions without needing to reread them. The drive felt longer than it should have, not because of distance in miles but because of the thoughts filling every pause between traffic lights. Each red light gave her another moment to reconsider turning back, yet each green light carried her forward as if something unseen had already decided the direction for her. When she arrived at the building where Daniel Brooks maintained his office, she remained in the car for nearly 2 minutes before stepping out. The structure was modest but professional, with glass doors and a reception area that felt intentionally neutral, as if designed to reveal nothing about the conversations held inside. She checked in quietly, her voice calm even though she could feel the weight of everything she carried internally. When she was finally called in, Daniel Brooks greeted her with a composed expression that gave away nothing beyond professional caution. He asked her to sit, and for a brief moment there was only the sound of papers being arranged on his desk. Then he looked at her directly and asked if she had brought the envelope with her. The question confirmed what she had already suspected, that this was not a simple matter of grief or inheritance but something structured with specific steps she was now expected to follow. Margaret placed the envelope on his desk without speaking, watching as he studied it with an expression that suggested recognition rather than surprise. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he asked her if anyone had contacted her after the funeral besides him, particularly a woman she did not know. Margaret confirmed the encounter, describing briefly the moment the envelope had been handed to her in the church. Daniel listened without interruption, his focus steady but distant, as if piecing together information that had been expected to arrive eventually. When she finished, He leaned back slightly and explained that John Collins had maintained several private financial arrangements that were not included in any standard documentation she would have been given after his passing. He chose his words carefully, avoiding unnecessary detail, yet each sentence added another layer to the growing realization that her husband's life had included structured secrecy. Margaret asked quietly why none of this had ever been mentioned to her before, and Daniel paused before responding that some instructions had been explicitly designed to remain undisclosed unless specific conditions were met. The phrasing made her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the implication that her entire understanding of her marriage had been contingent on conditions she had never known existed. As the conversation continued, Daniel explained that there were financial accounts and legal protections that required confirmation of identity and intent before any access could be granted, and that the envelope she had received was the first step in a sequence that would determine what information she was entitled to see next. Margaret listened carefully, her hands resting still in her lap, though her thoughts were no longer still at all. She began to see the outline of something larger than grief or secrecy, something closer to a system designed to remain invisible until activated. When she finally left Daniel Brooks's office, the city around her felt louder than before, as if normal life had continued without interruption, while she had been quietly moved into another layer of it. She stood outside the building for a moment, holding her coat tightly, and realized that returning home no longer meant returning to answers, but to uncertainty that had now been officially confirmed. And for the first time since the funeral, she understood that what had begun with a single envelope was not a message meant to explain the past, but a process that was still unfolding in the present. The drive back from downtown Columbus to Margaret Collins's home in Ohio felt shorter in distance but heavier in thought, as if the world outside her car window had been reduced to shapes and movement she no longer fully belonged to. She kept both hands on the steering wheel, though her focus drifted repeatedly to the implications of everything Daniel Brooks had told her. The idea that John Collins had created a structured system of financial arrangements that required conditions to unlock information left her with a growing sense that she had been living beside a life she never truly had access to. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the house looked unchanged, but she no longer trusted what unchanged meant. Inside, the envelope still sat on the kitchen table, exactly where she had left it, as if it had been waiting for her return with patience that felt almost intentional. She stood in the doorway for several seconds before stepping in, her eyes immediately drawn to it. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty but expectant, as if the space itself was aware that she was no longer the same person who had left that morning. She set her keys down carefully and sat at the table again, this time not hesitating to open the envelope fully. As she unfolded the documents once more, she noticed details she had missed before, references to additional names and coded identifiers that suggested multiple layers of oversight, rather than a single private account. There were mentions of scheduled reviews, legal trustees, and confirmation triggers tied to specific individuals. Each line reinforced the idea that nothing in this system had been accidental or informal. It had been built with precision and maintained over time. Margaret read slowly, her expression steady but increasingly focused, as she began to understand that John Collins's secrecy was not limited to financial privacy, but extended into a network of controlled information. When she reached a section that referenced a secondary contact protocol, she paused. The wording indicated that certain individuals could be activated as witnesses or verifiers, depending on how the process unfolded. One of the references matched a vague description she had already encountered indirectly through Daniel Brooks's cautious language, and that connection tightened the sense that she was being guided through a sequence rather than discovering isolated facts. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to organize the information into something coherent. But coherence did not come easily. Instead, patterns emerged that she did not fully trust yet could not ignore. The realization that her husband had structured not only his finances, but also the flow of information after his death, made her question how much of their shared life had been privately compartmentalized. A soft sound from her phone broke the silence. Another message from Daniel Brooks appeared, brief and formal, stating that certain confirmations were now in progress, and that she should expect additional contact from individuals connected to the estate process. There was no emotional language, only procedural certainty. Margaret placed the phone face down again, not because she wished to ignore it, but because she needed a moment where nothing new could enter her awareness. She looked around the kitchen, noticing again how ordinary everything remained despite what was now unfolding within it. The familiar cabinets, the worn edges of the table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator all existed in contrast to the complexity she was now holding in her hands. It created a strange division between what her life looked like and what her life was becoming. As the afternoon light shifted through the window, she finally gathered the documents back into the envelope, not closing it yet, but holding it in a way that suggested acceptance rather than resistance. Whatever system John Collins had left behind was no longer distant or theoretical. It was already active, already moving, and already beginning to reshape the boundaries of what she thought she understood about her past and the people connected to it. The following morning arrived in Ohio with a pale gray sky that offered no warmth, only a quiet continuity that made Margaret Collins feel as though time itself had not moved forward in any meaningful way since the envelope first entered her life. She sat at the kitchen table long before she needed to, her hands resting near the sealed documents as if proximity alone could help her make sense of what was unfolding. The house remained still, but it was no longer the kind of stillness that meant peace. It now felt like anticipation suspended in every corner. At exactly 10:32 in the morning, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number, and for a moment she considered not answering, but something in her now conditioned sense of inevitability made her accept the call. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm and precise, introducing herself as someone connected to the next stage of the estate process referenced by Daniel Brooks. She did not provide unnecessary detail, only instructions. She asked Margaret to confirm her identity verbally, then informed her that she was expected to attend a private meeting later that day at a location in Columbus, Ohio. The tone was neither inviting nor threatening, simply procedural, which made it more unsettling than either extreme would have been. After the call ended, Margaret remained seated, holding the phone loosely in her hand as she processed the fact that events were now moving independently of her choices. By midday, she was driving once again toward Columbus, though this time the journey felt different. The road was the same, the traffic unchanged, but her awareness of each mile carried a sense of inevitability. She noticed details she would normally overlook, such as the rhythm of passing vehicles and the quiet repetition of suburban storefronts, yet none of it grounded her. Instead, everything seemed to exist in contrast to the unknown meeting ahead. When she arrived at the designated location, a small private office suite in a building she had never visited before, she was greeted by a receptionist who appeared prepared for her arrival, as if her presence had been expected rather than requested. She was guided down a short hallway into a conference room that was deliberately minimal, containing only a table, several chairs, and a single folder placed precisely in the center. A few minutes later, Daniel Brooks entered the room accompanied by another individual, a woman Margaret did not recognize but immediately understood was the same person who had called her earlier. Daniel offered a brief nod before taking a seat, and the woman introduced herself again, this time providing her full professional affiliation as a legal executor consultant assigned to specific private estate protocols. She explained that the process initiated by John Collins had reached a point where additional confirmations were required, and that certain individuals previously identified in confidential documentation were now being contacted in sequence. Margaret listened without interruption, her attention fixed on the folder in the center of the table, which she had not yet been invited to open. Daniel then spoke more directly, confirming that the structure she had begun to uncover was intentionally designed to remain dormant until triggered by a defined set of conditions that were now being met. He did not elaborate on what those conditions were, only that they involved timing verification and external acknowledgement from multiple parties. The woman then slid the folder slightly toward Margaret, indicating that she was now authorized to review the next level of information. Inside were additional documents, including references to names she had seen before, financial oversight arrangements, and a formal statement that confirmed her husband's intention to distribute knowledge gradually rather than all at once. As she read, Margaret began to understand that what she had initially perceived as secrecy was actually a structured system of controlled disclosure, designed to unfold over time and through specific interactions. The realization created a strange tension within her, not only about what John Collins had hidden, but about why he had chosen to reveal it in this way. through absence, timing, and intermediaries rather than direct communication. When she finally looked up from the documents, she noticed Daniel watching her with a measured expression that suggested he was not surprised by her reaction. The woman beside him remained composed, waiting for acknowledgement that the process could continue. Outside the conference room, the building carried on with ordinary activity, unaware of the significance contained within the quiet exchange taking place behind closed doors. And in that moment, Margaret understood that she was no longer simply uncovering the past, but actively moving through a sequence that had been designed long before her husband's death, a sequence that was still unfolding and still far from complete. The conference room in Columbus, Ohio felt even quieter than before, not because the space had changed, but because something irreversible had shifted in Margaret Collins's understanding of everything she thought she was stepping into. The folder in front of her was now fully open, its contents spread carefully across the table by the legal executor consultant, each page arranged with deliberate precision as if the order itself mattered as much as the information inside. Daniel Brooks sat across from her with a measured stillness, his expression no longer holding uncertainty, only confirmation that the process he had been part of was now reaching its final stage. The woman beside him began speaking again, her tone calm and procedural, explaining that the sequence initiated by John Collins had now reached full activation under the defined conditions outlined in the original documentation. Margaret listened without interrupting, her eyes moving slowly from one document to another, recognizing names, dates, and references that had appeared in earlier envelopes but now formed a complete structure rather than isolated fragments. The explanation continued, revealing that John Collins had established a layered trust system, designed not only to manage financial assets, but also to control the timing and disclosure of information to specific individuals over time. Each layer required confirmation from multiple parties before the next could be accessed, and those confirmations had now all been completed. At the center of the documents was a formal statement of final designation. Margaret Collins was identified not as a passive beneficiary, but as the primary executor of the remaining estate structure, responsible for approving the final distribution protocol that had been intentionally delayed until after his passing. The words seemed to hold still on the page longer than they should have, as if waiting for her to fully accept their meaning. She read them again slowly, her breathing steady but her thoughts increasingly layered with disbelief and clarity at the same time. Daniel finally spoke, explaining that certain financial transfers and legal protections had already been secured in her name, but remained inaccessible until this final stage was acknowledged and signed. He added that this arrangement had been prepared years earlier, with specific safeguards intended to ensure that no single individual could alter the process once initiated. The executor consultant then placed another document in front of her, indicating that her signature would conclude the activation sequence and formally transfer control of the remaining assets and disclosures. Margaret did not move immediately. Instead, she looked down at the pages again, now understanding that what she had once perceived as secrecy had actually been a form of structured protection, built not to exclude her but to guide her through a carefully controlled unveiling. Her thoughts briefly returned to Sophie Collins, to the subtle distance she had noticed in her behavior, the carefully measured messages, and the moments of avoidance that now seemed more significant in hindsight. When she finally asked about Sophie, Daniel paused before responding that certain transactions involving her name had been reviewed as part of the verification process, and that those findings were included within the final documentation she was now holding. He did not elaborate further, but the implication was clear enough that Margaret did not need additional explanation to understand that parts of the family dynamic she had trusted had been quietly entangled in the structure she was only now seeing fully. The room remained still as she reviewed the final pages, each line reinforcing the same conclusion, that John Collins had not left behind confusion, but a deliberately constructed path that required time, witnesses, and confirmation before truth could be fully revealed. When she finally reached the last page, she placed her hand over it, not signing immediately, but absorbing the weight of what it represented. The silence in the room felt different now, not heavy with mystery, but settled with completion. Outside the building, life in Columbus continued as usual, unaware that a private sequence spanning years had just reached its final step within a small conference room. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly from the documents and looked at Daniel and the executor consultant, both waiting without pressure, And for the first time since the funeral, she understood that she was no longer being led through uncertainty, but standing at the end of a path that had been designed to return control to her rather than take it away, leaving her with not only answers about her husband's hidden life, but with the final decision that would define what remained of it.